Because an animal has been shaped by the natural selection of its ancestors, I think that there must be a signal from the ancestral worlds that is preserved in the body and genes of the animal. I think that biologists of the future will be able to read the animal as though it was a text, read the animal as a description of the ancestral worlds that shaped it. However, it can't just be one ancestral world because, of course, there's ancient and slightly less ancient and more modern and more modern. So it's a palimpsest, meaning a manuscript which has been overwritten, erased, overwritten, erased, overwritten, and so on. That's why I call it a palimpsest, because it is a superimposition of different timescales. What I don't have sympathy with is the distortion of language, which leads people to say that a trans woman is a woman, because that seems to me to be messing around with language going too far, and especially when it has the consequence of invading women's hard-won areas.
I'm not worthy. I'm John McWhorter, and thank you. I teach linguistics at Columbia, and I write for a newspaper. But my job tonight is to introduce somebody who you probably don't need to be introduced to, but this is the formality that we observe. The person is, of course, Professor Richard Dawkins. He is certainly my favorite public intellectual, and probably a lot of yours, and certainly one of the English-speaking world's top public intellectuals of any kind. And what can I say, except that he was actually born in Kenya. You might not have known that. And he did his work in university, first at Balliol, and then he got his doctorate at the University of Oxford. He did his PhD in zoology. Specifically, it was on animal behavior. But his stock in trade and his invaluableness to the world is that he's devoted not only to discovering interesting things, but sharing it with the public and not watering it down, making it the complicated stuff that it is, but making sure that he explodes our brains all the time. And I probably don't need to list the books, and so I won't give a complete list, but of course I'm referring to books like The Selfish Gene and The Extended Phenotype and The Blind Watchmaker, The God Delusion, of course, and now The Genetic Book of the Dead, a Darwinian reverie. And I should say that actually my favorite of all of them is The Ancestor's Tale, which is this marvelous, magisterial, mesmerizing trip that I wish I could do for language, but we don't know enough about how language is developed to pull it off. And so he did it. And if any of you happen not to have gotten to The Ancestor's Tale, I highly recommend it. You probably read War and Peace during the pandemic. This is the next long book like that you should read. And so there's this. And what's important about Richard Dawkinson's work? It's not for nothing that he was appointed the professor of the public understanding of science, with this being specified by Charles Simonyi as a position that had to first be occupied by Dawkins. That was in 1995. The reason is because he teaches us that the essence of science is not just to document things. It's not just to collect butterflies. The idea is to find the counterintuitive, The idea is to teach us things that we wouldn't have known before. For some reason, when I was a kid, my mother had a copy of The Selfish Gene on the living room table. And my mother was very intelligent. She was educated. She had a PhD for the record, but it wasn't in science. She didn't even like science. I don't know why that book was always on the living room table, but it was just there. And maybe partly because it had that funky cover when I was 11 or 12. I used to page through it, and I was just completely turned on. I didn't fully understand, but what I was getting was the rudiments of what I knew about how DNA worked from how my biology teacher had taught it were one thing, but it was another to learn this conception of what a gene was, that it was selfish, and that this, rather than the way the world seems to work, is the way it actually does. That was the beginning of Professor Dawkins being my favorite public intellectual. And I think that at this point, what will be most apropos is for me to bring him out here to share himself with you rather than me talking about him. And so, with pleasure, I introduce Professor Richard Dawkins. So, Richard, it's my job to ask you some questions. And I've been looking forward to doing it because, frankly, the genetic book of the dead, it's not, I call a lot of books when I review them potato chip books, like you can't put it down. This is a toffee book. It was that rich, it was that sweet, and it was that involving. And so what I want to ask you first is, what do you mean by the idea that all organisms contain palimpsests? That's the first time I've ever said that word, and I'm 59. Contain palimpsests of the past. What did you mean by that? Because that's the guiding theme of the book.
Because an animal has been shaped by the natural selection of its ancestors, I think that there must be a signal from the ancestral worlds that is preserved in the body and genes of the animal. I think that biologists of the future will be able to read the animal as though it was a text, read the animal as a description of the ancestral worlds that shaped it. However, it can't just be one ancestral world because, of course, there's ancient and slightly less ancient and more modern and more modern. So it's a palimpsest, meaning a manuscript which has been overwritten, erased, overwritten, erased, overwritten, and so on. That's why I call it a palimpsest, because it is a superimposition of different timescales.
Mm-hmm. Is this, therefore, something like, I read somewhere that honey locusts, which are common in the Northeast and in the United States, have these big, ugly maroon pods with the seeds in them. And they fall on the ground every fall, and they just litter the ground. There's nothing to be done with them. Nothing eats them. And you just think that that's the way the world is, but apparently those were designed so that the enormous mammals that used to live in, for example, North America and everywhere else would consume these big pods because they could, because they were so big. And through certain digestive processes, the idea would be that the seeds would come out of the animal.
Yes.
And therefore, and so the idea is that those pods, the honey locust, is a palimpsest in that way. Like you could maybe guess that something large ate them. Is that the insight that I'm supposed to get?
Yes, that's a very nice one. I didn't know that example.
I thought this would fit in. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, no, that I would, if I'd known it, I would have put it in. There's a nice example of a seed in, I think, yes, it's Mauritius, which doesn't germinate. And the reason it doesn't germinate is that it's pre-programmed to go through the body of a dodo.
Oh, wow.
There aren't any dodos left. And so it's going extinct. But they've discovered that it will germinate if it goes through the body of a turkey. And so it's been saved. Yeah.
That's so cool. Yeah. And so here's the next question. It's all about the gene. And so your biology teacher, mine was Mr. Oromenko, teaches you how DNA works, and you're learning that the organism is trying to pass on itself and be successful. And that's the kind of 1.0 version of natural selection. Your keystone idea has been that it's really all about the gene, which is not an organism. It certainly doesn't have consciousness, but it's not even a dumb organism. It's just the gene, and that what it's all about is the gene trying to propagate itself. What led you to that insight? What leads you to insist that it's the gene, especially in the face of all of the resistance that idea has
It's the only part of the hierarchy of living things which is immortal. Everything else dies. So the individual body lives for a while, passes on its genes, and dies. The gene, in the form of informational copies of itself, goes on potentially forever. And what that means is that the differential survival of successful ones versus unsuccessful ones really matters, because they have the potential to go on indefinitely into the future. If they didn't have that potential, then it wouldn't really matter which ones were successful. It's because they do have the potential to be immortal that it really makes a difference between the successful and the unsuccessful ones. And the thing that makes them successful is they program successive bodies via the processes of embryology to pass them on. So in every generation...
As in the bodies that happen to do that are the ones where the gene persists.
That's
right. To take away that
exactly
volition.
right. The bodies that are successful in surviving and reproducing pass on the genes that made them do it. So from the gene's point of view, if the statistical effect of their embryological influence is to make the bodies that they inhabit survive, then they survive too. Of course, sometimes good ones will find themselves sharing a body with bad ones, and then they won't survive. But statistically, over many generations, the ones that make it through will be the ones who have a good effect, where good simply means good in terms of keeping the genes going to the next generation.
This is a counterintuitive idea, as I was saying in my introduction. And of course, you know that. And there are some people who resist that counterintuitiveness by proposing that it can't be only about the gene. The gene is just something that an organism, quote unquote, works with. Then there are others who I get the feeling through my sense of the resistance, and I'm a linguist, not a biologist, but I read too much and I'm obsessive, is that some people are just disturbed by the idea that all of this that we're living, this wonderful life that we're living, that I get to be in Ireland for 3 days, etc., all of that is just about genes, like, for example, my own. And frankly, I agree subjectively. It's depressing, it's frightening, and it makes it sound like life is not really worth living. How do you work that part of it out? I felt that way reading The Selfish Gene when I was 12.
Yes, I had a letter when The Selfish Gene came out from a man in Canada who said that he had been talking to a student of his, and the student was thinking of suicide because of it, which horrified me, of course. And he advised her to stop reading the book and not recommend it to any of them. I think that's a bit excessive. The editor at Oxford University Press, who took the book on, he said he couldn't sleep for 3 nights after. Yeah. I think you shouldn't take it personally, would be my view. It's academic.
What? I mean, in life, and this is a genuine question, what that means is that is the truth, and I have no reason to think that it isn't. But what then does make life worth it for you? Just because?
I think that you have to put on one side the academic understanding that I am a survival machine for my genes, and to recognize that humans, having been put into this world to propagate our genes, we have been given big brains, and those big brains have been programmed by the genes to set up goals and purposes which have no immediate connection with passing on the genes. They can be writing a book, they can be writing a symphony, they can be winning a football match, they can be all sorts of things like that, they can be falling in love. There are all sorts of human level things which are only very, very distantly related to the ultimate purpose of passing on genes. And it's those things that make life worth living, and what makes my life worth living will be different from what makes the other people's life worth living. We all have our own hobbies and interests and purposes.
Okay, I get that. I should say that the Genetic Book of the Dead builds. And so if you haven't read it yet, you'll find that the first roughly 3 chapters are, if you know Professor Dawkinson's work, a wonderful review plus some additional examples of things that you have been happy to know before. Then it starts to go into places that are a little bit different, sometimes because you published these ideas more in academic places than in the trade places. And one of them was the chapter about reward. And I'm not sure I understood all of it, and I'm not just saying that as a stylistic way of bringing in the question. I didn't get all of it. What did you mean with your stipulation that, well, actually, it was your speculation that you could teach birds to get rewards through them being fed or given honey or whatever it is that birds like, and you could train birds to like Mozart and not like Stravinsky, or, and this one is even more counterintuitive, to like Stravinsky and to not like Mozart. What did you mean by that?
Okay, it wasn't actually training them. It was rather more breeding them to like Stravinsky or Mozart. The point is that when you train an animal with a food reward, it seems to be obvious. The animal does something at random, you reward it with food, so it does it again. So if you're trying to train a dog to shake hands, you wait until the dog lifts its paw a little bit, and then you reward it, and then you would wait until it lifts its paw again a bit further, and then you reward it. So that's the conventional way of training an animal, by operant conditioning. And we just take it for granted that food is the reward you use. It sort of seems kind of obvious. But the reason why food is rewarding is ultimately that natural selection has built into brains a rule that says anything that increases your chances of survival should be treated as a reward. And food is the obvious example of that. But you can generalize from that and say that anything which increases the animal's chances of surviving and reproducing should be treated as a reward.
But that means that the animal can always sense it as a reward, even if it might just be some other more abstract advantage?
Yes, because natural selection will have built into brains the rule of thumb: treat this as a reward. So if the animal's cold, then heat will be treated as a reward. That's another fairly obvious one. What's much less obvious comes up with the learning of bird song. When a male bird learns to sing, it teaches itself how to sing by listening to itself, kind of burbling at random.
And whether it matches with other birds.
Whether it matches a built-in template. So in the case of American song sparrows, where this has been worked out, the animal is born genetically programmed with a built-in template for what song sparrow song ought to sound like. So it then, when it's a young bird, it burbles at random, and every time it hears a phrase which matches the built-in template, it repeats it. So by definition, that's a reward. By definition, that's a reward because it repeats whatever it is followed by reward.
And it senses some sort of assonance or aesthetic pleasure in this. It feels like it got something right.
I would be happy to use the word aesthetic. And the reason is this, that the final purpose of this is to seduce a female. Now, the female is going to belong to the same species as the male bird who's learning to sing. So he's trying it out on himself. Anything that turns me on will probably turn a female on later on in life. And why wouldn't it? Because he's got the same brain, he's got the same nervous system. And so he's using his own brain as the template to teach himself how to sing in such a way that it will seduce a female. White crowned sparrows, a related species, does it a bit differently. They too have a template But in this case, the template is itself learned, but it's a different kind of learning. It learns it. It takes a kind of tape recording early in life, listen to its father early in life, listen to his father early in life, makes a recording of how the father sounded, and then uses that as the template. Once again, it serves as a reward. Now, I think you're absolutely right to use the word aesthetic just now, because what is it but when it tests itself, when it tests the song out on itself, that is judging it by an aesthetic standard. I think I'm right in saying that some of Beethoven's notebooks survive, and you can see the development in his notebooks of certain themes that we have come to know and love in his finished works. And you can see the embryonic forms of the phrases, of the tunes. And that's just like a bird teaching itself how to sing. And it doesn't only just work for music, it works for visual art as well. And I use the example of bowerbirds.
The bowerbird, right.
In Australia and New Guinea, where the male bird, instead of being ornamented himself like a peacock, he builds a kind of external peacock's tail out of grass and straw and twigs and things. A bower, which sort of looks, different species look like different things. It can look like a kind of archway. And this archway, this bower, impresses females. It seduces females. Females come to it because they like it aesthetically. And the male bird himself, while he's building this bower, again, he's trying it out on himself. He's using his own aesthetic sense as a judge of what a female is going to find attractive. And you can actually watch, I haven't seen a bowerbird, but I've seen, many people here perhaps have seen David Attenborough's films of bowerbirds. And they not only build the bower, they also decorate them with colored objects. There's one species which likes blue objects, and it goes around collecting anything blue, blue berries, blue beer bottle tops, and puts them in strategic places around the bower. And you can see it standing back and looking and saying, move that, put that. It's just like an artist touching up a canvas. Yeah. Once again, we have an aesthetic sense.
The wonder of that is, it's easy to see how it would evolve because the ladybird likes that, and so more and more and more. Why the blue is a wonder, but I'm not going to ask that question. I'm going to ask this question. Because in that chapter, this was just fascinating, but there was a little bit less on what about the woman bird? And so what I didn't understand is, why is the female bird choosy? And the female bird usually is. Theoretically, wouldn't it help to pass on the genes of the creature if she were not any more choosy than the male? What is the purpose within the theory of natural selection of her being so choosy?
I think it's right to say that we're wrong to assume that females necessarily benefit from mating with any particular male. So, on the whole, males will mate with anything. Females are more are more fussy, and there's good reason for that. It's a good economic argument. Females have large gametes. Eggs are big, sperms are small. Eggs are expensive, sperms are cheap. So the female is in possession of the economically valuable resource. And that fundamentally lies behind this extra choosiness on the part of the female. As to why she might like blue, now that's a more difficult question. When Darwin first proposed the theory of sexual selection, he simply treated it as a kind of given. It's just a fact that females of the species like blue. Wallace, who was his co-discoverer of natural selection, hated that idea because he thought it was mystical. I think you have something like the same intuition that why would you like blue?
Yeah. Is it because of the blue sky? Does it have something to do with blue sky?
I don't think so. I think there's something. It's more arbitrary than that. Darwin never solved the problem, and Wallace didn't either. it was solved by R.A. Fisher in the 1920s or 30s. Fisher suggested that just as we regard the male, whatever it is, in this case the bower, but it could be the peacock's tail, that is under genetic control. In the same way, the female taste is under genetic control. So you could imagine, let's talk about peacocks, not bowerbirds for a moment. You could imagine peacocks with different colored feathers, male peacocks, and you could imagine peahens with different tastes. And there's no reason why, just some happen to like this color, some happen to like that color. And if there's any tendency for, purely at random, a majority of females to happen to go one way, perhaps a fashion, perhaps a bit like a human clothes fashion with miniskirts or backwards baseball hats, whatever it is.
And that sets in.
Then once a majority starts to form for a particular taste, then any female who deviates from that vogue will have less popular sons. And so it behoves a female to conform to the majority taste. And mathematical models have been made of this process, and under certain conditions, you get a runaway evolution towards ever increasing whatever it is. It happened to be blue, it might happen to be red, it might happen to be long tails, short tails.
So if you rolled the tape again, it could be cardinal red that happened to set in.
It could be different. That's exactly right. It could be different. But whichever way it starts, the runaway process carries it on.
Right.
And that was Fisher's theory. It's probably right in many cases. There are rival theories which may also be right.
But there's a way of basically incorporating chance refutably and intelligently such that it can be explained.
Yes, and different species of bowerbird have different, I mean, another species prefers white things.
That's just what you would expect. Okay, right. Yeah.
And they use snail shells, white snail shells, bones, pebbles, that sort of thing.
Because that's what's set in their world. Yeah. Let's stick with birds.
Yes.
There's a bird in southeastern Australia. It's called a funnel bird. I forget why, but there's a thing about it. It can, this thing can, no, it's not a bird. It's some sort of marine creature. Let's call it a snail. It's a funnel snail. The funnel snail can kill a human. It's got venom. And especially nowadays, you can take the venom and you can figure out that the venom has 3,000 molecules. I think it's exactly that number, or there's some other number, but one of the molecules is what can kill a person. Then there are 2,999 other molecules. This is why I'm mentioning this. Your way of looking at all of this stipulates that nothing is due completely to chance. And so you mentioned that your father thought that there couldn't be any reason within natural selection why oak leaves and beech leaves have different crenellation. And so there's always a purpose, as opposed to the spandrels that Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin talked about. Doesn't that mean, and this is just for the sake of clarity, doesn't that mean that every one of those other proteins in the venom of this creature must have some kind of purpose, or it must be some sort of step towards the poison? How come it's only that one? Do you really think that all of the other proteins in that venom have some sort of purpose? I'm picking an extreme example because I'm really trying to figure out how this works.
I don't know the example you're talking about. You sure you don't mean funnel spider?
Spider, yes.
Okay.
I know, some disgusting creature, right. Yeah.
Okay. I still don't know the details. So it doesn't. Okay, I mean, I can't answer for the specific. What I can do is to say, to produce the argument which I think I probably used to my father when he talked about the oak leaves and the beech leaves. J.B.S. Haldane, the great mathematical geneticist, did a hypothetical calculation about trivial characters which you can't really believe there's any difference between an oak leaf with its shape like that and a beech leaf shaped like that. Why should there be any difference?
It's just serendipity.
Just very, very, very slight, tiny difference. But Haldane said, okay, let's put a number on it. Let's say that there is a very, very, very slight advantage, which we can't really understand, but it's so slight that you can't measure it. And if you were to go out into the field and actually try to measure the survival value of this rather than that, this genetic characteristic rather than that, you would find it was so trivial that when you measured hundreds and hundreds of cases, you couldn't find that one survived better than the other. Nevertheless, put a figure on it. So that for every 1,000 creatures that possess this form and survive, 999 that possess that form survive. So it's 1,000 versus 999. No insurance actuary would be the slightest bit interested in such a trivial difference. Nevertheless, because natural selection works over many, many generations, that's the immortality of the genes again, Haldane calculated how long it would take for this trivial difference to manifest itself such that 50% of the population, starting from just 1%, how long would it take to increase to 50% in the population? And the answer was, depending on whether it was dominant or recessive, something like 12,000 generations, which is trivially short compared to the fossil record. It's so short that in a normal animal or plant, a paleontologist wouldn't notice it. It would appear sort of instantaneous. So there's a kind of mismatch between the rate of evolution at the field ecology level and at the paleontological level. Haldane was deliberately setting the advantage, whatever it is, to be so trivial that you couldn't measure it. And even so, it would be dramatically fast on the evolutionary timescale.
There's still a subjectivity there. I wonder, is there something wrong with there just being a bit of mess, with some things being due to chance? Or is it uncomfortable because it would be hard to know where to draw the line? It's just cleaner to...
Yes, I wouldn't mind it. I mean, I think my intuition is the same as yours. It feels right to me that it should be trivial. But if necessary, you can trot out the mathematics to show that even something that we judge to be trivial, natural selection put it this way, natural selection is a better actuary than we are.
All right, I'm going to try something, and I have to be careful because I got in big trouble about this about 15 years ago. I am not a creationist. I am every bit as atheist as you. To the extent that anybody might think that a Black American is usually very Christian, that's true. I somehow missed the memo. So, nothing. However, there are times when I find myself frustrated. It's not that I find myself believing in God, but I find myself believing in something else. And you know, one of the things, and I have never had a biologist give me a coherent answer about this, but I know you will. The skunk. So, we all know what skunks do. They turn backward, even that, and then they squirt, and they've got this stuff. That it's clear how that helps the skunk. But I have never understood how that would evolve step by step. We don't need to talk about how blood clots and all of these Michael Behe sorts of things. It's the skunk. So there are all of these animals that are mustelids, and they're weasel things. I think otters are part of it. All of them kind of have, if I may, smelly backsides, and that's whatever that musk is for, sex or marking territory, fine. The skunks have a version of that goes squish and makes things go away. What would an intermediate version of that be? At first, there's some, weaselous, back in like the Miocene or something like that, and it kind of drips a tiny bit. Well, that's not going to make things go away. It would have to be some sort of giant, silly mutation where one weasel happened to have balloons back there instead of holes. But that's not the way it works. How do we get to skunk? And it's not going to be in the fossils, and so we have to speculate. Right?
Yes. I don't find that all that difficult. No, I'm going to disappoint you probably.
I want to hear this.
I mean, the fact that there's a slight smell, what we need, we always need a gradient. We always need to have a gradient. What we cannot have is a sudden precipitous...
No.
Okay. So the fact that all these creatures, these mustelids, have, as you say, smelly backsides, will mean that that when an enemy is right close to them, they will be put off. Distance is by its very nature a gradient, and so what will be put off close by to a weasel, say, will be put off a bit further away from some other mustelid, I don't know, a stoat or something, and then you go all the way to a skunk. There's another very similar example, which creationists actually love, which is the bombardier beetle. Have you come across that? Yes. Yeah. And this one is...
How does the musculature emerge?
It's a bit more difficult because the bombardier beetle, it doesn't just make a nasty smell, it actually squirts out boiling hot liquid. It kind of explodes with boiling hot liquid out of its rear end. And this is produced by a chemical reaction putting two chemicals together. I think one of them is hydrogen peroxide. I've forgotten what the other one is. Hydroquinone, I think. The creationist argument is that the intermediates would all blow themselves up.
I read that.
Yes. The trick is it needs a catalyst. I actually did a demonstration of this when I did the Christmas lectures for children in London, because I got a bottle of hydrogen peroxide and a bottle of hydroquinone, and said I was going to mix them together. And I put on a World War II helmet, goggles, and invited anybody who was nervous to leave the room, and nobody did. And I poured these two liquids together, and nothing happened. And the reason was that the catalyst was absent. So then I varied the amount of catalyst as a gradient, and putting in a little bit of catalyst, you got a little bit of heat, slight raise in temperature, a bit more, and you got a substantial rise in temperature. More catalyst, you got a whoosh like that. So once again, we have a gradient. It's a question of how much catalyst you put in. The standard creationist argument, it is always looking to erect a precipice when there's actually a gradient, and the trick is to find the gradient. Even if you can't find the gradient, that could be a limitation of your own, my own ability to understand, rather than saying, because I can't think of where the gradient is, therefore it's not there. I mean, they have many. What's the use of half a wing? What's the use of half an eye? There are lots of different
kind of
versions.
Solvable.
Yes.
So, yeah. But like even with the beetle, let's say it got really hot in there. But how do you evolve the mechanism to get it out? Like to make the hole big enough, et cetera? Like, wouldn't that have to happen at the same time?
You have separate glands for the two chemicals, and I suppose maybe a third gland for the catalyst. I'm not sure how that works. The dose gradually increases, and so you get once again we get a gradient.
Is there any process in the organismal kingdom that baffles you, where you sense that the tools that we have, I say we as if I'm a biologist, that you have, would have a really hard time explaining? That's a genuine question.
Possibly. I can't think of an example now, but it wouldn't greatly worry me if I could, because I would simply say we need to put a graduate student on to work on it. I mean,
So there are hard ones.
Yes, I mean, there are puzzles which need solving, but you don't overthrow an entire corpus of theory by one example.
Never.
I've called it the argument from personal incredulity. It's not impressive to say, I don't understand. I had a chapter in, I think it was The Blind Watchmaker, where the then Bishop of Birmingham was saying he couldn't understand why a polar bear should be white, because a polar bear has no enemies. I mean, and what he overlooked, of course, was that a polar bear needs to creep up on its prey.
Yeah, a theory is not a wheel, it's a rope. And so if one strand is out of place, the rope can still be strong.
Yes.
Yeah, these exceptions do not make me think all of it must not be true, but it's just slightly frustrating. I want to read you the final line of your book. It would look better if I did it like this.
Yeah.
So, folks, you should know I'm not looking at my texts. I put the questions on the phone. So, the final line is, you are the incarnation of a great, seething, scrambling, time-traveling cooperative of viruses. That's the final line of the book.
Oh dear.
What?
I was hoping you'd overlook that.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's the final line.
Right. I make a distinction between horizontoparasites and verticoparasites. And a parasite's job is to get itself into the next host. And a parasite like the virus of the common cold might get itself into the next host by being sneezed out of the present host, or perhaps you wipe your nose with your, again, you could touch the door handle, and there are various ways in which the virus, but that's horizontal. It goes out from the present body and then is picked up by the next one. A verticoparasite is one that travels from one host to the next into the child of the next host. Into the child of the present host. So it travels in the gametes of the present host, in an egg, for example. So imagine a virus that is, its only method of getting into another host is to travel in the egg of the present host, and then it finds itself in the body of the child of that host. Now, I have this idea which is called the extended phenotype, there's a whole chapter on this in the book as well. It's the idea that the genes in one animal can exert their effect not necessarily on the body in which they sit, although that's the usual way, but on something outside the body. It might be an artifact like a bowerbird's bower, or it might be another individual. And in the case of a parasite, it often is another individual. Parasites very often manipulate the body of the host in which they sit to make that body more likely to pass them on. In the case of a horizontoparasite, it may actually make you sneeze or make you cough, and therefore pass itself on. The rabies virus causes dogs that have the virus to foam at the mouth, to bite other individuals and to wander far and wide, all of which are calculated to pass the virus on. So this is the extended phenotype.
Oh, that's the foam too. I never thought about that. The foam.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. Well, now, think about the extended phenotype of a horizontoparasite and a verticoparasite. In a horizontoparasite, it makes it sneeze, it makes it foam at the mouth, whatever it is. A verticoparasite, the extended phenotype, the influence that the virus or the bacterium, whatever it is, has on the body in which it sits will be aimed in exactly the same direction as the animal's own genes. This is because it wants the animal to survive and reproduce, because that's its only route to the future. It's got to make it wants the animal in which it sits to survive, to reproduce, to pass on the eggs. So to the extent that it can have any influence on the behavior of the host in which it sits, the effect that it has will be the same as the effect that the genes of the animal itself has. Why then do all our genes work together in such a cooperative way to make us, to make bodies? Why do they all pull together? Why is it such a cooperative enterprise? The answer is that they all aspire to get into the next generation by the same exit route. They all want the body to survive, reproduce, pass on the eggs or sperm. They all want exactly the same thing. That's why all our own genes cooperate with each other in a joint enterprise to build a successful reproducing body. A few of them don't. There are rebel genes that break out, but most of them are cooperative because they share the same hopes, the same aspirations of the future. And horizontal parasites do too. So my conclusion is that all our own genes should be regarded, vertigo parasites want that too. So my conclusion is that all our own genes should be regarded as mutually supportive, cooperating vertigo parasites.
Counterintuitive and marvelous. I like that it was the final line. Opening things up a little bit, I took from one of your passages that you are of the opinion, and I want to make sure that I'm not misquoting you, that King Lear and Beethoven's late quartets are not likely to stand the test of time. You were talking about science and how science progresses. We learn new things, how to make an elevator, CRISPR, etc. But in the humanities, things don't advance. And I found that counterintuitive because King Lear, frankly, is deeper than Beowulf.
Yeah.
Beethoven's late quartets, I think, are deeper than most music being written now. And so what do you mean by that?
I have to apologize for that. I was really simply making the point that if we were ever visited by aliens from outer space, what can we communicate? What will be the language that we communicate them with? It will be science and mathematics. Much as we love Beethoven, much as we are moved by King Lear, it will mean nothing to an alien from outer space, but physics will, because they must be physicists or they couldn't get here. It's not, I wasn't intending to denigrate Shakespeare or Beethoven at all. I was intending simply to say that there's a kind of filter, purely when we're thinking of aliens from outer space, that the only thing we'll have in common with them is science and mathematics.
You mean real aliens rather than little green humans in leotards? You mean because the aliens are probably, they're blobs, they're air.
Yeah, whatever they are, they may be radically different from us, but they couldn't get here unless they knew a whole lot of physics and mathematics.
Okay. I get that. I just wondered what you meant. I would not be doing my job if I didn't ask you this next one. In social commentary, especially in social media these days, and also in various writings of yours, you go places beyond natural selection and the nature of science. And I ask you this out of genuine curiosity. This is not a challenge. But in more than one piece of writing, you have said that if someone feels that they were born in the wrong body, that they are male, but they should be female, biologically male, I am going to use that term, but they feel that they should be female. You say that, and you say this in complete sympathy, but you say that it's a form of dysphoria, and I presume would be something that someone might want to undergo psychiatric treatment about. Whereas there are other people who would say that that is just a certain kind of socio-psychological flutter, that there are some people who are born that way, and that the solution is simply to allow them to be not what they feel that they are, but what we can assume that they actually are. Where do you draw a line there? What's the difference between dysphoria and a person just having been born different?
I think the word dysphoria is something that trans people use themselves, actually. I mean, it's As you say, I have sympathy with people who feel that they are born in the wrong body. I was moved very much by reading long ago Jan Morris's book Conundrum. She had been James Morris originally. James Morris was the only journalist on the first successful expedition to climb Everest. But James Morris always felt a woman struggling to get out. And so he undertook hormonal treatment and eventually surgery and became...
and liked it. Not the process, but he was satisfied.
Yes, and ended up remarrying the mother of the children that he had fathered when he was a man. It's a very moving book. She's a brilliant writer and describes the subjective sensations very well. So I have a great sympathy with that. What I don't have sympathy with is the distortion of language, which leads people to say that a trans woman is a woman, because that seems to me to be messing around with language going too far, and especially when it has the consequence of invading women's hard-won areas and women's sports events, when somebody with male physique easily carries off medals in swimming or boxing, whatever it might be. And that, I think, is cheating. And I sympathize with those women, biological women, who object to it.
But Jan Morris is a woman? Or would we say that Jan Morris is a man?
I would be happy to treat her as a woman and to use female pronouns and to call her she and to interact with her as a woman. But I would not wish to say that a woman can have a penis, for example, which many people do. I think that's a postmodern step too far.
Because of, in particular, the sports issue.
Well, no,
that's the restaurants.
That's the practical issue. But I defer to you as a linguist. But I think that that where madness lies if we are prepared to distort language to such an extent as to say that a person with a penis is a woman just because they say they're a woman.
It is a very sensitive issue, and I had no idea we would be at this point on it when I wrote my book coming out in April, which is called Pronoun Trouble, which actually addresses issues of the new use of they and them, etc. The publicity for that is going to be more complicated than I expected because of the tenor of the discussion these days. But I just wanted to know where you stood on that. And also in terms of your commentary beyond biology, the God delusion. I read it and applauded. However, I always wondered, and I'm sure you've been asked this question before, but I must ask it again. Did you hear from people who said that they had been convinced by the book? Were there many? And if there were many, what was the passage or the point that tended to have the most effect in the book?
I can't answer the second part. Quite a lot of people said they were.
Okay.
And even more people said that they had the book articulated for them what they felt already, but didn't have the words to put to it.
Right.
I don't know which parts of the book may have converted people. I would like to know that, actually, but I don't.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I thought this makes perfect sense, but I wonder if it has a purpose. And so the new atheism, as it's called, it's something I've tried to follow as closely as I could. And do you feel that it's been having an effect other than stirring up controversy and that then you therefore have to defend yourself against?
Yes, new atheism is not a phrase that I either coined or use. So it was, I mean, there were, I think, 4 books that came out roughly the same time.
Yeah,
and that was coincidental. There was not a
That wasn't
There
planned?
wasn't a conspiracy.
I didn't know
or anything.
that.
No.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, statistics show that religious belief is declining. Gallup polls show this. Even in America, they show this. Whether we had anything to do with it, I don't know. I'd like to think we did, but I don't know. Don't know for sure.
I've always wondered. I'm going to ask one last question on a lighter note, but it's still fascinating to me. Why do you speculate that bats hear in color?
Oh my, yes.
Because that's really cool, but where does that come from?
Okay. The subjective sensation of hue that we get, blueness and redness and greenness, yellowness, these are internal labels which the brain uses to label light of different wavelengths. There's nothing about long wavelengths that is inherently red. It's just that our brains arbitrarily tie the label redness.
So we're not seeing anything real. These green signs.
We're seeing a kind of virtual reality, which is constructed in our brain.
That's depressing, but still true. Okay.
I don't think it's depressing. I think it's rather nice, really. But anyway, so the ancestors of bats would have seen color, not such good color, because most mammals don't have 3-color vision; they have 2-color vision. We old world monkeys, which is what we are, have 3-color vision like a digital camera, but they would have had 2-color vision, and when they went effectively blind, when they turned over to using echoes of their own cries instead of eyes, they must be constructing a virtual reality model of the world in which they fly. And a very accurate model it is, because bats can, without using anything but sound, we're using only echoes, bats can navigate and avoid fine wires that are strung across the room. They can not see them, they can hear them, they get them from echoes. But the internal virtual reality world that a bat uses to navigate, I think, must be rather like the virtual reality world that a fast-flying bird by day uses to navigate. The bird is using its eyes, the bat is using its ears, but both of them are using these senses to construct an internal model which enables them to navigate through the world, avoid hitting obstacles, and enables them to catch flying insects, which is a difficult task because the flying insects are taking evasive action. Right. When bats took up echoes instead of sight, instead of vision, there were these color labels left hanging, doing nothing. They had these color labels in the brain which had no purpose left. What could be more natural than to use them as labels for something to do with echoes? Maybe the texture, maybe they use, I don't know, blue for furry texture and red for shiny texture, something of that sort. That's pure speculation, obviously. But I think that natural selection is a pretty parsimonious economist and would not willingly just simply throw away these perfectly good brain labels, and would instead use them to signify something in the world, in the virtual reality world that they create. So that's my purely speculative suggestion for why bats hear in color. There was a famous paper by a philosopher called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" and I think it might be rather like being a swallow.
This is what I mean by science being about the counterintuitive. That's amazing. Yeah. This is, we've reached an inflection point where instead of me asking questions, the audience is now going to ask you questions in the form of ones that I read out from attractive little cards. And so let's transition to that. Professor Dawkins, do you expect any change in the basic laws of evolution? taking into account the intellect of humans?
Well, I suppose the questioner means, by referring to the intellect of humans, means that humans might actually steer the course of evolution. And we already do that, of course, with dogs and cabbages and roses and horses. We've steered evolution for centuries, thousands of years, actually, by artificial selection. So I suppose that will continue. The questioner probably also means manipulating the mutation half of the Darwinian equation, actually changing the genes directly. That is increasingly possible. And we might see domestic animals and plants being manipulated more and more, not just by selection after the mutation's taken place, but actually manipulating the mutation itself. As for whether we might manipulate humans, we haven't used artificial selection to manipulate humans so far, or we could have done.
Do you think we will?
Well, I don't know. I mean, why haven't we already? When Hitler tried it, but mostly just haven't done it. If a nation, if I don't know, North Korea decided to win all the Olympic events in 500 years' time, you could start breeding for brilliant high jumpers and pole vaulters and sprinters and things. It hasn't been done. And then genetic manipulation, manipulating mutation, that again is possible. And people have speculated about it being done. It's not being done much at the moment, but it perhaps could be.
It's going to be done. Nobody asked me. Sorry. How do you think Donald Trump will impact science research?
He has announced his intention to place Robert Kennedy Jr. in charge of health. If that's a serious possibility, I mean, we may expect to see epidemics of measles, mumps, polio.
I'm ashamed and I didn't vote for him. It's not me.
I hardly think he would have done. I think he's a catastrophe for the world. He's vain, vindictive, vengeful, self-obsessed, lazy, stupid. But some people that I respect seem to have voted for him. And so maybe I keep searching for silver linings. Maybe there's a silver lining. It's quite hard to think of one at the moment. But
there's no silver lining. No,
okay.
So it's bad. Do you feel that the new atheist movement often misrepresented the... Oh, dear. Oh, wait. Do you feel that the new atheist movement often misrepresented the sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland as stemming from religious belief as opposed to political and cultural differences, particularly Christopher Hitchens?
Well, I recognize that the troubles in Northern Ireland have deep economic and social roots. However, I do think that religion must be the way in which the various tribes recognize each other. And therefore, if 300 years ago somebody could have waved a magic wand and abolished Christianity, I suspect we would not have had the Troubles. That's, of course, very hypothetical.
Do you think that the world would be better off without any kind of organized religion or religious thought, despite the comfort that it gives probably most people on Earth? And what would you tell them to seek for that kind of warm, roast chicken on Sunday, we are part of the same thing, I am not alone comfort, if there is no religion. We all get it from different places, but then again,
Yes.
if you are an atheist, you've managed to pull something off, but we're in the vast minority. What do you tell the world?
Yeah. Well, I suppose, roast chicken on Sunday, you can have that.
But what about the other days?
It's true. It's true that many people do get comfort from religion. The first thing I say about that is that doesn't make it true. It's pretty obvious, but there are people who can't distinguish between it makes me feel comfortable, it comforts me, and therefore it must be true. Of course, it's nothing of the sort. Whether you get comfort from something is one thing, whether it's true is a completely different thing. I, as a scientist, care passionately about what's true, and therefore, even if I could get comfort from a falsehood, I would be quite incapable constitutionally of believing in a falsehood simply because it makes me feel comfortable. Actually, I think the capacity to make you feel comfortable is probably exaggerated. For everybody who thinks they're going to go to heaven, how many people fear they're going to go to hell? It's not all comfort, is it?
No, but I'm sure you know there can be truly marvelous, in the old sense of the word, marveling to see how comfortable many people are with things that they must know on a certain level are not true. Maybe the idea for them is that there are alternate truths, there's another realm. A very, very good friend of mine became a Mormon in his teens. And I've stopped having conversations with him about this because I can see that there's no progress. But when we were in our 30s and 40s, I would ask him things like, do you really think that at some point somewhere there was a talking snake? Do you think that actually happened? Because we've never seen any. And I said, you can tell that there aren't any. The fossil record doesn't show any. You can kind of tell that's not true, right? And he said, no, I believe that there were talking snakes then. And somewhere in his cognition, he's worked that out because he's a perfectly intelligent person who drives and uses advanced equipment. For you, that's bad.
Well,
because it gives him great comfort.
I'm very surprised he became a Mormon. I understand people being born into Mormonism.
That's a whole other story.
Yes, okay. But the talking snake, he just needs to be told, ask him who he thinks wrote the book of Genesis. It's not as though it was written by anything other than just humans. And does he not know that peoples all over the world have their origin myths and they all have a certain aesthetic beauty, and there's nothing special about the Genesis? It's just a pure accident that he happens to have been born into a Christian country where it's the Jewish myth happens to be the one that made it through. But
he knows all this. I'm going to push it a tiny bit more just to see what you would say. I've asked him, do you really believe that a man bent over in his backyard and dug up tablets that happened to be written in biblical language sometime in the 1820s, et cetera, et cetera? Did that really happen? And he said, yes, it did. And I looked him in the eye and I said, I can tell that you don't. But we just left it there because without all of this, he would have nothing to live for. Is your idea that maybe he should be left alone because his psychology is formed, but that we should make sure that younger people are not taught that way?
I am baffled by, I'm much more baffled by somebody becoming a Mormon than being a Christian. Joseph Smith was a known charlatan. It is known that another of his alleged translations is the so-called Book of Abraham, which he allegedly translated, and then it was conveniently lost. And then it was found and was properly translated by people who knew the language. And whereas he translated it as being all about Abraham, it turns out to be nothing to do with Abraham. The man was a complete fake and a charlatan. Tell your friend.
My response to being, as one might predict, around 13 or 14, a bit of a misfit, was to drown myself in books such as yours. His response to that was to join a warm, loving community and to leave a little bit of cognitive dissonance to the side. And I think that explains it, but it's not my favorite thing either. But in any case, what are your thoughts on Satanism?
Well, if you're going to believe in a supernatural being, there's no particular reason why it should be a good one. You might just as well be an evil one. The evidence is equally good for both.
Do you feel, given our genetics, that mankind is doomed to war?
Oh gosh, I hope not. There's a rather good book by Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which takes a historical view, a very long historical view, suggesting that we're actually getting better and that we are the rate at which we die because of homicide is getting lower. And the argument is unassailable, frankly. I think so. I mean, even despite the terrible wars that we had in the 20th century, it's a very, he's a beautiful writer, and I strongly recommend it. However, if we are genetically specified for war, is there anything that we might do about the extent to which it still happens now, or do we just have to wait? Well, I would hesitate to say we're genetically specified. I mean, I suppose there might be a certain tendency towards tribalism, towards loyalty to a tribe, and us versus them. It can be overcome. Numerous individuals have overcome it, and we should take heart from that. Well, I would ask you another question about this, which is that we just talked about Steven Pinker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature, which makes that argument. And yes, we can look at, say, Gaza right now, but in terms of the bird's eye view, life for humans is much less violent, and it continues to be. And yet, Pinker has been shot at like a varmint about that book. There are people who are furious with him for that argument. What do you think makes it such that a happy book like that, laced with such exhaustive statistical detail, offends so many brilliant people? I don't know that. One of the other points that he makes, either in that book or in another book, is that many of us, even those of us who consider ourselves to be sort of educated, tend to base our beliefs too much on the tribe to which we belong. I'm not talking about genetic tribe now, but something like the Democrats or Republicans there's experimental evidence of people evaluating evidence not strictly on the basis of the quality of the evidence, but on the basis of whether it goes in favor of or against their preconceptions based upon a tribal loyalty. Mm-hmm. And so maybe he's come in for some victimization because of from his own tribe, his own tribe of sort of intellectuals who I think that's his the other book, Enlightenment Now. Enlightenment Now, yes. Confuse him. Why is it, though, considered a mark of being an enlightened person in certain circles to be so recreationally pessimistic about the nature of humanity? He makes that point as well. I mean, it's a very valid point, actually, that good news doesn't make news. You never read in the newspaper some heartening piece of optimistic news. That's not news. It's not news. No. Yes. Less hunger. Is insisting that God exists equally unscientific with insisting that he doesn't, provided that for both cases no scientific evidence is available? Yes. You could say the same of leprechauns, couldn't you? There's no evidence. You can't disprove the existence of leprechauns. They just might be found. And right. The little people. Why, if you don't believe in leprechauns, do you believe in God, I suppose?
Maybe because people want to believe in God because of the sense of community that you get, such as my friend, as opposed to leprechauns where...
Well, then I would come back to my point that sense of community, sense of being comforted has absolutely no bearing whatever on the truth value of claims. It can be comforting. Again, to quote Steven Pinker, when you're being chased by a tiger, you may derive comfort from your belief that it's a rabbit, but it isn't a rabbit.
That's obviously true. I completely get that. But goodness, the power that it exerts upon people to be part of a group, to be part of, not to sound dismissive, but a herd, that sense of group membership, often, as you're saying, trumps, so to speak, strict logic. And human beings tend to be very comfortable with that. I once said, sorry to interrupt, but very briefly, with my friend, one of the arguments we had in our 30s, he said, well, John, you're telling me that there are all these things that should be based only on logic and the way he intoned logic was the way I would say something like finger paints. Like logic as if there's something beyond logic sometimes. And that he does believe, and not just only fantastical things about snakes. I think he's human in that way.
Yeah.
I wonder if that can be fixed. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't have anything to say to people like that. I just can't. I think, coming back again to the point, who does he think actually wrote these books, and why doesn't he follow the religion of the Maori or the
He knows. He knows. But when you watch him say we about Mormons, we this, you can see the electrodes of warmth going off in his brain.
Yes.
He wants that we-ness because he didn't have it when he was 13. And I don't think it could ever be cut through. And I always think this is Homo sapiens, as in it's probably built in to us.
The Mormons must have got at him, I suppose. Because it could have been the Jehovah's Witnesses, or it could have been the Muslims.
Talk about the beech leaf and the oak leaf. It could have tipped that way, and it would have been, as a matter of fact, that's exactly what happened to his other friend. And I imagine that guy and I could have the same conversations, but he's a we too. We. And there's that sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Has there been a scientific, I like this one. Has there been a scientific discovery that's made you think, no way, or completely surprised you?
Yes, I mentioned it in the book. The discovery that whales are even-toed ungulates. They are related to hippos, and hippos the closest relative of a hippo is a whale, and not a pig or I mean that really shook me. I thought if that's true, and it is true, then anything goes.
I'm going to break out a word only because I want there to be a recording of my saying this after my demise. Mesonychids? Is that the artiodactyl that the whales came from?
Yes.
I said it. All right. Are there any key ideas or concepts in this book that challenge your earlier thinking? That's from Mikko Saarinen of Finland.
Well, I suppose the one I've just said, actually. As I said, I thought if that can be true, then molecular... I seem to be wheezing. Sorry. Molecular genetics could throw up some... mice could be closely related to, goodness knows, aardvarks. Actually, they're not, but
Well, just to play devil's advocate, from what I happen to read about this, these mesonychid things are these bearish things that gradually started living in the water. And there's this beautiful fossil record, especially from Pakistan, of this kind of awkward bear otter thing that gradually, not an otter, but not a bear, but it's this thing that gradually becomes a whale. And so we know exactly how it happened.
Yes.
Given that we have the fossil record and actually in relative detail, what is especially counterintuitive about it? I mean, I would have felt that way before.
Well, the fossil record is there, and it's very excellent. The counterintuitive finding is molecular. It's actually looking at the genes.
Okay.
If you look at the molecular sequence of the genes of a hippo and a whale, they come out to be closer cousins of each other than of anything else.
Yeah. Interesting. Are there, that's the same card. In your career, have you seen anything comparable to gender ideology? Do you see it sticking around?
Well, I think it's a religion, and so I do see it comparable. I mean, I think it's very like a religion.
In what way?
In the way that the vicious punishment of heretics, for example, it's actually very close to Christianity in that the transubstantiation, which Catholics believe in, where the wine becomes the blood of Christ, the bread becomes the body of Christ. This is playing with Aristotelian categorizations, the essentials and the what are they called, the accidentals and the essentials, so that Aristotle made this distinction between the accidental properties and the substance, the true substance. So in the true substance, the wine is blood, but in the mere accidentals, it's an alcoholic liquid. Hence the word transubstantiation, and that's exactly what happens. You have somebody who announces, although they have a penis, I am a woman. So in the accidentals, they have a penis, but in true substance, they are a woman. It's a very close analogy to Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And then also, in general, a certain tenuous relationship to factual argument where it becomes inconvenient. And so you get that kind of what you could call magic, seems to me, what you're saying. And so do you see this as something that will persist, or is it a trend?
I don't think it will persist. No.
How come? Because people hold a lot of those views very passionately, I would say, in academia.
Think the tide is already turning. Yeah.
Couple more. Dear Richard, can animal intelligence, sentience, be seen as a continuum across species? Can animal intelligence, sentience be seen as a continuum across species? If yes, at which point of this continuum should humans grant the right of personhood to these animals in order to have the right to have rights? I imagine this would apply to the great apes, et cetera. Then thank you, and a friendly, smiley face.
Yes. This was something that Darwin was very exercised about, constantly trying to emphasize the continuity between other species, other mammals especially, and humans. The philosopher Peter Singer, the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, initiated something called the Great Ape Project, where he tried to initiate a movement to grant to the great apes, that's chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, human rights. And the question asks about the continuity of sentience and presumably consciousness. I don't think there's any reason to suppose that consciousness suddenly got switched on somewhere around Homo erectus in our ancestry. It must be that there are degrees of consciousness, just as there are degrees of so many other things. I think there was a major step in human consciousness, in human evolution, when language was invented. And here, this is your subject and not mine, but it does seem to me that language provides a gigantic leap away from the rest of the animal kingdom.
It has to, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the hierarchically embedded syntax, which enables us to express such an enormous variety of things.
And the ability to talk about things that are not there,
that are not
and
there.
in great detail.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would say that there is a major discontinuity, and exactly when it happened, we don't know, of course, whether Homo erectus had language. What do you think, by the way?
The fashion is becoming, and it took me a while because I don't like change, to think that Homo erectus did have language, which would actually put the invention of language back almost 2 million years.
Yes.
It may not have been language that we're using now, because these things generally tend to happen gradually, but there's evidence that they were of a sophistication that would suggest that they were able to talk to each other in ways beyond what baboons.
And it's right, is it, that all human languages are essentially equally complex?
No, it's the fashion to say that they're equally complex.
Okay, I was wondering about that.
Various reasons, and that's obviously not true. Some languages are much more complicated than others, but there are no simple languages. There's a basic level of complexity which is complex, as in a book this thick. But there's some that are like this thick, like most Native American languages. If this is English, this is Russian, Czech, or Polish. This is any language of New Guinea. Some languages are much more complicated, but the baseline is still awesome and creates all of the nuances of humanity.
And Anglo-Saxon, have we deteriorated since Anglo-Saxon
Anglo-Saxon was more complex on most levels than the language that we're speaking now. We are speaking Old English as beaten up by Vikings, and we're speaking it very fluently. But yeah, English is a beat up language. Yes.
Right. Okay.
But this is your show. I don't know. What happened before evolution? I.e. the 9 million year gap between the Big Bang and the beginning of life. Was it only 9 million?
Billion.
Billion is what I think the person means. But yeah.
Physics and chemistry. And then what happened when life arose was the first self-replicating molecule. And that would have been an accident. We don't know how rare an accident. We don't know how improbable an accident. If it was exceedingly improbable, then that means that we may be unique in the universe. I don't believe that. But it's a corollary of believing, if you put it the other way around, if you believe we are unique in the universe, then that commits you to the belief that the origin of life on this planet was a stupendously improbable event. And I don't believe that, but the two go together.
Of course, it may have been, because if it was a stupendously improbable event, there still would be us to feel it.
Exactly. We're here talking about it.
Right.
Yes.
But no, it's not the most parsimonious.
So we can't rule that out. But it has the consequence that we're wasting our time even thinking about it, because we're not looking for a plausible theory. We're looking for a vanishingly implausible theory.
Some people do those things.
Yes.
Okay, here is the last question. How have you dealt with close friends or family members whose beliefs differ from yours? Religious, anti-science, etc.
How did I deal with, was it family members?
Friends or family members. Close friends or family members.
Well, if the questioner means religious things, I don't have any.
I knew you were going to say that.
Obviously, I mean, scientists do disagree. I mean, there's a whole chapter in that book arguing with
certain
close colleagues who got it all wrong.
Right.
And they wouldn't agree that they got it all wrong if they were here, of course. I mean, I deal with them in a friendly, amicable way. We argue it out.
and without feathers flying too high or anything like that?
Yes. In a very friendly way. I had a public debate at Hay-on-Wye in Wales with Dennis Noble, who's the main person, and I began by confessing that he had been my doctoral examiner many years ago, which made it a bit difficult.
And yet you and Noble, there's a whole controversy here. You and Noble then had a beer or something like that.
Yes, we get on fine, yeah.
That is the way things like this should be.
Yes.
And, scientists should be like Richard Dawkins. And I think it's now time for us to give him a hand for all that he's done and all that he will do.
Thank you, John. That was fabulous. You did that so well. Thank you very, very much.